Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this session on what is ESG. I'm excited to be discussing this with you, and thank you to Jen for having me here. I will be answering questions live after this session, but for now, let's get kicked off to talk a little bit about what is ESG, what does it mean, and how does it affect my business? Let's start with the definition of ESG. ESG stands for environmental, social, governance. So really what that's referring to is how a company manages its corporation around these topics. The corporate management systems that are in place for other important topics such as risk management or finance can be borrowed when thinking about how to incorporate ESG into your strategy. What I mean by that is that really it all starts with policies, which lead to actions, which lead to results. And the governance piece is how is that managed, who's responsible, and who's accountable. When looking at ESG in the context of your business, it's helpful to actually turn to the most common reporting frameworks that fall under the ESG reporting categories. There's many of them out there right now, but you can see a few along the top of the screen here, such as the International Labour Organization, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, ISO, and the Global Reporting Initiative, as well as SASB, which will likely be, according to the SEC's mandate for publicly traded companies, the accounting standard for actually reporting on sustainability in public reports. One thing to note is that the standardization of ESG reporting is still very much a challenge. So you might hear all sorts of acronyms related to these reporting frameworks, as well as many others, but know that they all in some way, shape, or form will touch on these 4 pillars of sustainability and the criteria that you see underneath. So starting with the environment, the E in ESG, what falls under that category? We have your classic environmental metrics, such as energy, water, waste, GHGs, which stands for greenhouse gas emissions, which includes carbon, but also very important for the beauty industry, product use, product end of life, and customer health and safety. So you'll notice that when you're putting this into the context of your business, different topics will have a varying materiality. So for example, if I'm a cosmetics company and I don't own any of the manufacturing facilities that are making my products to sell, I know that sustainable procurement will be a high materiality to my business. It's extremely relevant because the products that I source, from raw materials to packaging to transportation and logistics, will all affect the environmental and social factors of my business. Let's take product end of life, for example. What does this mean? Well, in the context of ESG, what that's referring to is what happens when the consumer's all done with it. I think a lot of people are familiar with the stat around plastics in the ocean and thinking that there's going to be more plastic than fish in the sea by 2030. This is largely based on the fact that we have a massive plastic pollution problem. And even though the packages that we sell our consumer goods and beauty products in are sometimes recyclable, the fact of the matter is that only around 8% of plastics are actually recycled. The rest of them end up in landfill and the ocean. And I can speak firsthand, as I'm sure a lot of you can, to what kind of problems these are, actually creating for this world. One thing I'll also touch on today, just while we're on the topic of plastics pollution, is EPR. That stands for Extended Producer Responsibility. This is something to look out for, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it when we move into the regulation slide. So moving into the social pillar, we define social as including anything that would affect the people associated with your business. That includes employee health and safety, working conditions, anti-forced labor, as well as diversity. There are more topics that fall under the S in ESG, but these are some of the main criteria that are covered. Governance looks at corruption, anti-competitive practices, as well as responsible information management. So think about data security. And then last but not least, sustainable procurement. We talked a little bit about how this relates to a beauty company that's not manufacturing any of its own goods. But what are your suppliers doing to ensure that they're considering consumer health and safety when it comes to the ingredients? Or how are they procuring or manufacturing plastics or packaging in a way that will be easily recyclable, or in a way that has a take-back program, for example? So all of these factors fall under the broad scope of ESG. So there's 3 key benefits of ESG to your company. The first is risk mitigation. Let's be honest, there's a lot of companies that end up in the news because of factors related to environmental impact or labor and working conditions, and many others related to ethics. When you factor ESG into your business strategy, you're helping mitigate risk. This could be reputational risk, but it could also be other types of risk related to being able to fulfill your customers' orders and maintaining a healthy supply chain. The second one is cost optimization. You might hear in some of the headlines and white papers recently that sustainability doesn't mean it has to be more expensive, and that is the truth. I had a great call with someone today at one of the big 4 accounting firms who said, I was working with a company who actually didn't realize that they were sourcing organic cotton and just regular cotton. And the organic cotton not only had way less carbon emissions associated to it, but it was also cheaper. So in some ways, by putting a focus on ESG, you'll be able to optimize the cost going into your products and services. Last but not least is value creation. A lot of this comes down to consumer loyalty and being able to innovate in the market that you're in. It's no secret that consumers are more geared towards sustainably made products and have been more loyal to companies who align to the same ethics and beliefs as them. Let's talk about value creation a little bit more. So here's a stat or a quote from the Boston Consulting Group in 2020. It says, businesses that are considered leaders in environmental, social, and governance criteria have an 11% valuation premium over their competitors. For all of those indie beauty brands out there, it should be music to your ears. Ears should be perking up. That's because one of the most common strategies that I see within independent beauty is that you're looking to grow the value of your company and potentially have that lead to something like a buyout or a merger or acquisition of some sort. It also means more revenue for your organization, better growth, and more strategic investors. We know 70% of consumers are willing to pay a sustainability price premium. You can walk into your local Sephora or other retailers and really see that there's a correlation between price point as well as consumer loyalty and the actual sustainability criteria. So like I mentioned before, this leads to innovation, it leads to strengthening of your brand, and it can also help you expand into new markets that have strong regulations, or also just new markets in general when it comes to target consumers. If you're not convinced yet, here's a little bit more to put in your tool belt. First and foremost, 83% of C-suite leaders and investment professionals say they expect that ESG programs will contribute more shareholder value in 5 years than today. They would pay a 10% premium to acquire a company with a positive record for ESG issues. Case in point. On the other side, thinking about the consumers and employees, 84% of global consumers consider sustainability important when choosing a brand. And 62% say they're willing to change their purchasing behavior to help reduce negative impact. So even if you're able to showcase to the consumer what it is that you're doing to, let's say, engage suppliers, to ensure fair working conditions, diversity, equity, that you're making your products in a mindful manner, and you're showing them and educating them how to properly dispose so that it doesn't become landfill or ocean waste. These are all ways that companies are gaining consumer loyalty by leveraging the key components of ESG. Now, going back to that main point that I mentioned, which is sustainable procurement, there's really a huge opportunity within your supply chain as a beauty company. In working for Ecovadis, we know this is true because we have thousands of buyers and thousands of suppliers working together. And that actually creates trillions of dollars passing through our solution that are actually considered with ESG criteria before a purchase is made. The supply chain opportunity is huge. Think about your own operations. You might have completely virtual offices now. You don't own any manufacturing facilities. A lot of what you do is based on your laptops, R&D, as well as, let's say, employee travel. But think about your suppliers. You might have a handful of suppliers, or if you're a bit bigger, a couple hundred suppliers. So take your impact and multiply that by a couple hundred. If they're manufacturing suppliers should be considered even higher impact. They have more emissions, they have more waste, and they also can potentially pose more risk with relation to working conditions and labor and human rights. So focusing on your supply chain as a starting point will allow you as a brand to factor in these specific criteria when you're actually in R&D, when you're developing that new product to put out into the market, rather than creating something and then trying to move backwards. So this can really help you, this supply chain sustainability, when it comes to finding the right partners. If you understand how to benchmark a supplier side by side, you can make those decisions up front and really save yourself when it comes to all sorts of different factors, including cost, but also carbon emissions, and also backlash from customers who want to see more sustainable products. I talked about regulation a little bit, but focusing on supply chain even more so here. Over the last, I would say, 10 years, we've seen different supply chain due diligence laws pop up all over the place. Most recently, we saw the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US. We also saw the German Supply Chain Act come out, and we know that the SEC has also proposed mandates around due diligence and disclosures. So if you're thinking about ESG from a compliance lens, you're essentially going to be playing a game of whack-a-mole, because each of these blue dots, you're going to be trying to hit them on the head, trying to stay ahead of these regulations if you're going to be taking a compliance focus. The idea around ESG is to integrate this into your business operations, into your decisions from the get-go, so that one, you can stay, aligned with all the requirements from a regulatory standpoint, but that you're staying ahead of market expectations, and that you're really, using ESG to drive value rather than just to be compliant. I talked a little bit about EPR, or the extended producer responsibility. In the US and in Canada, there's been a number of different laws and bills, either passed or proposed, that say the producer of plastics or goods that are very hard to recycle and are sold in masses, those producers should be responsible for the waste that they're creating. Why? It's because, one, consumers don't always know what to do with those when they're done with those products. And two, the infrastructure that different states and provinces have are very overloaded with all the different plastics and packaging and everything that we're trying to recycle when we do make that into the blue bin. So what that means for you, if you're a manufacturer, is that you should be thinking about how to incorporate recyclability, labeling around what to do with the product or package when a consumer is done with it. And you should be looking at different materials and weights and recycled content to help be part of the solution. If I'm a brand, I need to think about this in the context of sourcing. So what I would do is say, if I have 5 suppliers that all make packaging for beauty products, I want to know what each of them are doing to ensure A, recyclability, B, that post-consumer recycled or bio-based products are used as inputs, and then C, that the labels on these packaging are clear and a consumer knows exactly what to do with that. I will say that being in this space for a few years now, and actually working for a cosmetics company prior to this, consumers say something around sustainability and wanting to make a difference, and they're willing to pay more for it, but they don't always know what to do when they're done. So think about this and think about the responsibility that we have when we're creating new products for the market. So now that we know what ESG means, let's think about how you can integrate it into your different business processes. So we know that we need to think about different topics like the environment, carbon, labor and human rights, ethics, procurement. What the step-by-step process really looks like is, first you need to identify your risks and your opportunities. This usually starts with conversations with suppliers, understanding what goes into R&D, and being able to assess those sustainability practices based on evidence, and also by using the most common reporting frameworks in sustainability. You'll need to monitor and track the actions that your suppliers are taking so that you can better understand performance and compare them side by side. That way, when you're creating something, you know who you can actually strategically partner with to create a more sustainable option. The more you do that, the stronger your relationships are going to be. Potentially, the stronger your sales will be as well. And that could lead to cost optimization and being able to sell this premium product without actually having to pay a premium price to suppliers. It's the whole concept of economies of scale. And if enough beauty companies are doing it together, that's going to help the market as a whole. Then it's all about improving. So the more advanced companies that are leveraging ESG criteria in their decision-making processes are not just taking the data, they're actually using it to drive improvements, to engage suppliers in their plans, and to actually give them resources to help the suppliers become more sustainable. So it's a really collaborative approach, and there are so many great examples within the beauty industry of companies that have honed in on this opportunity, and I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot about that today. Last but not least, when it comes to those regulations and when it comes to reporting to your investors, all of this is going to help you have effective and evidence-based information that you can be confident in reporting on. So if you're thinking, okay, we need to go back to our business and really incorporate this in, what is this going to look like long term, and where do we start? This isn't something that's going to happen overnight. There's going to be a lot of different iterations. That's generally why companies tend to partner with execution partners like Ecovadis, because we really help lay that foundation and provide best practices. But doing this internally, you would want to start with integration into policies and your processes. So how do you procure today? How do you do R&D today? How do you select materials and ingredients today? From there, align your stakeholders from these different groups on what it means for your brand to be sustainable. What are the key components of ESG that matter most to you, to your consumer, to your investors? Map out where those risks are, and then understand what you're tracking and develop KPIs so that you can have a reporting mechanism and you can track progress over time. Usually from there, we see optimization, right? So you've laid the groundwork, you know where your risks are, you have a baseline. Now we want to look at how to be strategic in terms of partnering, how we can improve the metrics that we're collecting. You want to train your employees and also your suppliers on what it means to be sustainable and how to make those decisions. And also meet with your internal stakeholders. I think that annual, biannual steering committee meetings are very important for keeping things on track and for staying abreast of market trends. The third year of a program in which Ecovadis runs is really about benchmarking and where to go from here. So once you've laid that foundation down, you've made some improvements, you've found some strategic partners, that's usually where we see the magic happen. So this is innovation. This is stuff that makes the headlines, you know, first company to create a bio-based tube for cosmetics. This is where we see a lot of companies entering the market as a differentiator and something that you can actually capitalize on even as a small brand, because those bigger companies have been doing this for longer and have brought their suppliers along with them. So don't be afraid to leverage your community. Of course, that's probably why you're here today listening. I would always be happy to connect with people who are like-minded and think that this is important and kind of drive that message forward and help you understand where to get started. There's a lot of different initiatives within the beauty industry, such as the Responsible Beauty Initiative and others that you'll hear about. But tap into these, listen in, hear from your peers on what they're doing so that you can really take that into account for your own business. Now I'm going to be answering our Q&A. I appreciate all of your time and attention for listening on this crash course of what is ESG. And with that, I will hand it back over to you, Jen.